Morning all. Boris Johnson is joining the diplomatic efforts to prevent a war in Ukraine. Downing Street says he'll speak to President Putin next week and visit the region in the coming days. President Biden, meanwhile, has announced he'll be moving US troops to Eastern Europe and NATO countries in the near term as the military build-up around Ukraine continues. But in Kiev itself, the Ukrainian president has warned that all the talk of a possible Russian invasion is just creating panic. Well, tensions between Russia and Ukraine have certainly been ratcheting up and are now expanding beyond the borders of the two countries. Forces in Eastern Europe now comprise key members of NATO, including the United States. There's a NATO military presence in Poland, Germany, Lithuania, Latvia, Romania and Bulgaria. But this is what faces Europe. 100,000 Russian troops on the entire length of the European border and into its ally Belarus. While in Lithuania, fighter jets from Denmark, Poland and Belgium will be flying above the Baltic states to police the airspace. Our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn reports now from the Ukrainian capital.
In the snowy wastes of western Ukraine, British-supplied anti-tank missiles being put through their paces. If Russia does launch an invasion of tanks, they can expect this kind of reception. But how soon that invasion could happen is reportedly now causing a rift between the US and Ukraine. While America says an imminent invasion's a real possibility, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is insisting it isn't.
There are those who suspect that you are talking down the threat of an imminent invasion just to preserve your economy. And actually, the Americans are right. It is a real possibility that that could happen imminently. Is that what's really going on here?
We do understand what's happening, and we're talking about this. We're talking about this with our people. But we have been in this situation for 8 years, so we shouldn't be only looking up. We're also looking on the ground. And for us, it's an important question. We may lose the current economy of our country. People come first.
In an hour of questions, the president was asked again and again about differences with America.
President Zelensky has been walking a fine line between his government's position and America's assessment of the threat Russia currently poses. His officials, though, have been more blunt.
One Ukrainian security official said today allies should supply weapons, but otherwise keep quiet. It's all welcome news to Vladimir Putin as the Russian leader keeps the world guessing about his intentions. His foreign minister was sounding diplomatic.
Our president already said that if our attempts to negotiate over suitable security guarantees in Europe does not give any result, then we will respond. Answering that direct question about what kind of response it could be, he said, any kind. My decision will be based on our military leaders' proposals.
But America's ambassador to Moscow wasn't convinced.
It's the equivalent of if you and I were having a discussion or a negotiation. If I put a gun on the table and say that I come in peace, that's threatening.
The daily feed of Russian propaganda goes on. While talking diplomacy, it seems Russia is still preparing its military for conflict. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Kiev.
Meanwhile, the US President Joe Biden reiterated overnight that he will be moving US troops to Eastern Europe in response to Russian forces massing on the Ukrainian border. He spoke to reporters at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland.
Any update on the situation in Ukraine?
No, not in the last couple hours.
Have you decided how soon you would be moving US troops to Eastern Europe?
I'll be moving US troops to Eastern Europe and the NATO countries in the near term.
A few of the day's other stories now. And the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has approved the extradition of the British tech magnate Mike Lynch to the United States to face criminal charges after he lost a fraud case in London yesterday. In what's believed to be the biggest civil fraud trial in British history, Dr. Lynch was accused of deliberately overstating the value of his software company when he sold it to Hewlett-Packard in a multi-billion-dollar deal 11 years ago. Joni Mitchell has become just the latest high-profile name to wade into the row over Spotify platforming anti-vaccine content. The singer has joined Neil Young in asking for her music to be removed from the platform over concerns that the streaming giant promotes Joe Rogan's podcast, who she says has been spreading lies about COVID. Now, there are fears for the safety of an entire community in Afghanistan who say they're being persecuted and hunted down by the Taliban. The minority Hazara people are now living in fear every day of the ruling regime. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has warned that without more help, Afghanistan is hanging by a thread. Our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, has been to meet a community that has now gone into hiding.
They're all on the run, going from house to house to try to keep ahead of Taliban fighters bent on revenge. All of them worked for or were trained by the foreigners who pulled out nearly 6 months ago. Many have letters of commendation and pictures alongside their former foreign friends. Now they and their children are Taliban targets, feeling abandoned by former allies and hunted by those now in power.
They left us behind and now we're not safe. So I ask the international community to please help us, either with our security here or get us out of here.
In this place.
She was shot?
Yes.
While she was travelling? Her mother was a soldier in the Afghan army, gunned down a few months ago. The rest of the family are terrified they're next.
We are nervous about for our security, our family. We don't want to go another country or any good situation. We want to live in safe situation in our country, but this is not possible.
This is a video. The Taliban has searched my home.
They say the Taliban promises of an amnesty for those who worked with the foreigners have come to nothing.
Taliban is unbelievable. And they say wrong, they say a lie.
Among the group is the son of the female head of Herat's women's prison. His mother, Alia Azizi, disappeared nearly 4 months ago, and they've not seen her since. He breaks down, telling us they think she's being held by the Taliban because she's a woman and from the Hazara ethnic group.
Thank you.
The meeting quickly splits up. They're all Hazaras. And very anxious, word will get out that they're here. They head back into hiding. Since the Taliban took power, thousands of Hazaras have fled. Half of those who lived here have gone, mostly over the border to Iran. One of the elders tells us the persecution they felt for so long is far worse under the Taliban.
We're all from the same country, but they don't recognize the Hazaras as their fellow countrymen. When we go to government offices, they won't even talk to us.
The challenge is making sure the aid reaches those who need it, and there are concerns it's being misused by the Taliban. With most money frozen and aid halted by the international community, the new Taliban regime's been offering food aid to workers in exchange for salaries. But that's led to claims that the aid's only going to Taliban supporters. That's hit the Hazara worst. They've always been anti-Taliban. And whilst the UN's trying to ensure aid goes through groups they've approved, most Hazara we spoke to feel the discrimination keenly. It's happening all over Afghanistan, she says, but the Hazara are the poorest and worst hit, and the Taliban don't like us. For the Hazara, the war's not over. This was the latest bombing, less than a week ago, in the heart of the Hazara community. 7 people were killed, mostly women. ISK said they did it. For the Hazaras, the attacks are coming from all sides. Among the victims was a single mother. Her 5 young children are now all alone. They're terrified and helpless. There was no one to help my mother, she tells us. And if anyone had helped, she'd still be alive. She's also angry at the lack of everything here. There wasn't even an ambulance, she goes on. They took them to hospital in private cars. They're still in shock, but they know this means trying to find work in a land that doesn't even recognise their right to do that. My little sister cries all night until morning, she says, asking where her mother is. She's very young and scared. Female, Hazara, and now orphans, with no one to look after them. Alex Crawford, Sky News in Herat.
Now, after days and weeks of waiting, Sky News understands that Sue Gray's report on those Downing Street parties will land on the Prime Minister's desk in the coming hours or days. But there's certainly much uncertainty about how much will be released to the public after the Metropolitan Police requested that a redacted version be published to ensure that nothing jeopardises their own inquiry. Let's speak to our political correspondent, Rob Powell, who's in Westminster for us this morning. Rob, so in the coming hours or days, the report will be received. Well, it looks like it's going to be a busy few days for the Prime Minister then.
Yeah, shortly the report will go to the PM, and then after that we know that Boris Johnson plans to make what he has given public, give it to MPs as well, and then make a statement to the House of Commons as well. The fact that Sue Gray has decided that she wants to put the report out before the Metropolitan Police finish their investigation means, though, that the detail in that report about the events that the police are investigating will be minimised, that not all of the information that would have initially gone in there will be present. I think on a surface level, it's generally accepted here in Westminster. That's probably good news for Boris Johnson because it decreases the chance of a sort of acute moment of danger where a big unvarnished report threatens to sort of tip MPs over the edge and put their letters of no confidence in to try and remove the Prime Minister. That said, there's a lot of unknowns. We don't know how bad the Gray report will be for the Prime Minister, even in a redacted form. There will be a lot of pressure here in Westminster for the full details to come out if there's a feeling that anything too damaging is being held back. Of course, there's also the chance as well of additional damaging details being leaked or made public in other ways. I think Boris Johnson is also helped politically in terms of his fight to stay in his position by the fact that there is a lot of other stuff going on at the moment. We learn overnight that he will have a phone call with President Putin about the situation in Ukraine in the coming days. He will also make a trip to the region next week, presenting the possibility that MPs may be discussing his future while he is in Ukraine talking about a potential Russian invasion. Also this weekend, Boris Johnson will be considering various options he's been presented with in terms of bolstering troop deployments in the region as well. So it's clear that he's not just interested in talking. The Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, as well, who's expected in Moscow in the coming couple of weeks, will be in the Commons on Monday announcing a beefed-up sanctions regime against Russia as well. So the situation in Ukraine, cost of living, rising energy bills, the potential for the levelling up white paper, that big plank of government policy coming next week. I think the fact that there is so much other stuff happening, big, important stuff as well, potentially does help Boris Johnson when he appeals to MPs to essentially give him some more time and not to move against him.
Rob, thank you. Well, let's return to the Prime Minister and his trip to the region, trip to Ukraine, we should point out. We're joined by the Conservative MP Tobias Ellwood, of course, Chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee. Mr Ellwood, great to see you this morning. What hope, in your mind, that Boris Johnson's arrival on the scene can actually sort this situation out with Russia? I'm being slightly facetious, but of course it is an important trip that he's making.
It is an important trip, but we need to keep this in perspective. After Afghanistan, the West has looked somewhat disunited. From a Russian perspective, there's never been a better time to invade Ukraine, something Putin has been wanting to do for a long time. He's enjoying this international attention. Every time a leader puts their hand up and says, I'm going to go to Moscow to try and talk this, of course he's going to say yes. He is spinning this out. I doubt whether any invasion will take place until after the Beijing Olympics. China would have made sure of that. But more widely, I'm pleased to see that we're beginning to appreciate why Ukraine is important. An invasion would have huge consequences for oil and gas prices, not just in Ukraine, but right across Europe. There's also the issue of grain. 1/3 of the world's grain comes from Ukraine. Our food prices would also go up. Indeed, some of the food perhaps on our shelves might even disappear. So the penny is dropping. And I'm encouraging that we need a simpler but more effective solution, and that's directly supporting Ukraine. It's time to show strength, a sense of purpose, not to hesitate and not to hide behind the fact that Ukraine is not a NATO member. And I hope Britain has, gains greater resolve to recognise the importance of supporting our democratic ally and make Putin think twice. This is our Cuban Missile Crisis moment, and we must not blink.
What then, Mr. Elwood, should be the extent or perhaps the limits on British involvement in whatever does transpire on the Ukrainian border?
Well, absolutely, we can't do things alone. Putin is exploiting the collective weakness across Europe and beyond. If you think about it, what's going on in Washington, Berlin, Paris, and indeed London, we've all been facing different directions. If we are going to have greater resolve here, we must all look in the same direction. But that's where the convening power comes in. That's where Britain can step forward. America is hesitating here a little bit. If we offer that convening power, put forward a plan to support Ukraine in its time of need, I'm sure other nations will then follow.
Is there an inevitability to conflict between the West and Russia over the issue of Ukraine?
Absolutely. We played into Putin's hands for the last number of months. He knows that if sanctions are put in place, firstly, they will have little effect. And secondly, he's very content. He's made the rather grander strategic decision to turn to the east, to look to China. Any sanctions that are put in place, he will actually end up being able to take his own country, convince his own people, look, the West don't want us, they're our enemy, let's look to the East. In my personal view, there needs to be an off-ramp over the next couple of decades that allows Russia to turn back, to look to the West where it's more comfortable. That won't happen under Putin, but what happens in the next few months to do with Ukraine has such bigger consequences. This is a turning point in our history, and we need to recognize this bigger picture.
But surely in the shorter term, Mr. Elwood, as regards Vladimir Putin, we're looking for an exit ramp for him right now, aren't we? In the sense that he will be unwilling, perhaps unable even, to remove those 100,000 troops from the Ukrainian border without some sort of concession that he can take back to his electorate in Russia.
Well, I don't believe he's answering to his electorate at all. I'm not sure the Russian people want this. He's spinning out the idea that NATO is the aggressor that wants to actually attack Ukraine. That is not true at all. Ukraine is wanting to, go down the democratic path, and they are being attacked. It is absolutely right for us to defend Ukraine in its moment of need. We need to understand the language that Putin respects, and that's the use of force. If we actually put in a NATO division in there with enhanced force capabilities in the surrounding nations, he will think twice. He will not want to trigger another European war on this scale. That's the language Putin understands. That's the direction that we should be going.
Given their veto, do you think that Russia will respect anything that the United Nations says on this issue?
Well, you actually point to one of the problems that we have at the moment, which is why there's a 1930s feel to the world at the moment. These international institutions aren't able to hold errant nations to account. It requires good nations, as we saw in the last century, to step forward, to be bold and not be intimidated by the likes of Putin and other authoritarian regimes.
Mr. Elwood, you will understand that we cannot have a Member of Parliament on the programme at the moment and not reference the Sue Gray report. What is your view of what has happened over the past 24 hours with the Metropolitan Police perhaps muddying the waters slightly and forcing redactions into the report?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a horrible few weeks. Problems with the rules written by Number 10, not followed by Number 10. And latterly, to add to that misery, it's now the handling of the crisis, which is also a concern. And we must not forget this is all actually happening under the gaze of the nation. And they're looking for evidence that we are going to change, that we want to rebuild trust, that we're sort of fit to govern. So this discussion, this talk, this suggestion that somehow the Sue Gray report, which we've waited for so long, might even be redacted or somehow watered down, will not go down well with colleagues. There remains a deluge of fury with the British public, appalled by what's happened, and they want to see that we're on the road to change, that the command, the discipline, the cultural changes will actually be introduced to Number 10. Not any form of cover-up, not any form of simply trying to get the Prime Minister to short-term survival, but genuine reform that can actually take our country forward.
Tobias Elwood, great to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A major revamp of the Highway Code comes into force today, giving cyclists and pedestrians more rights and more protection from traffic. But it's been criticised by the AA, which says that pedestrians could be in more danger from people not knowing the new rules. Sky's Sadia Chowdhury joins us now from Richmond Park, of course, one of London's top cycling hubs. And how are these new rules going down there?
Well, the whole point of these new rules is to try and make the UK's roads safer. We've already got some of the safest roads in the world, but now what's happening is 9 sections of the highway code have been updated, and about 50 new rules have been either added or amended. Now, not all of them are going to be things that people are familiar with, and I have to say at this stage that the rules do come into force today, and they're advisories, so you won't get fined for non-compliance. Some of it will seem quite new. There's something called a Dutch reach, which you might have heard about in the last few days. That's where drivers are being urged to use their left arm to reach over and open their car doors, and the idea of that is it's meant to force you to sort of turn your body and your head and look behind you to check if any cyclists are coming. I'll go through some of the changes with you now. Now, the new guidelines states that traffic should give way to pedestrians and when pedestrians are looking to cross at junctions. It says cyclists should ride in the centre of lanes on quieter roads in slow-moving traffic and when approaching junctions. That's to make themselves as visible as possible. And it's introducing a hierarchy of road users. So drivers will have more responsibility to those on bikes, horses or on foot, and cyclists will have to be more aware of pedestrians. And as I say, these are advisories only. But there are some concerns about how drivers will respond to these changes. The head of the AA is worried that some people will be really rigid about it and, stop as soon as they see a pedestrian at a junction trying to cross and perhaps be hit in the back by another vehicle. And the RAC is raising concerns about that not many people are aware of these changes, and if that's the case, then someone might know that the changes come into effect, somebody else might not, and they might end up getting into a clash on the road over that. And a recent survey found that 33% of road users aren't aware of the changes, including 4% who say they don't intend to look them up.
But with us this morning to review the papers, the broadcaster and author Gemma Forte and Tom Slater, editor of Spiked Online. Good to see you again, guys. Gemma, to you first. Inside the Mail, Simon Jenkins' piece today. Forget Partygate. How could we do that? Well, he's suggesting that the 4.3 billion lost to fraud might be a bigger story.
And I think he's got a very, very good point. Just at a point when we're all looking at this cost of living crisis and the extra money that we're all going to be forking out, whilst I think we all appreciate that the Treasury had to just open up the coffers and furlough was a success and everything, this is an egregious waste of money. What's interesting about this is Lord Agnew is like an archetypal Tory, if you like. He donated to the party, he got given a peerage and a knighthood, he campaigned for vote leave, etc. And he himself, his company has benefited from government contracts. But in integrity shocker, he has been banging his head up against the wall, and he resigned in Parliament last week, having absolutely hit a wall of complete and utter frustration, because the Treasury just seemed to not care about this money that has been swindled from the banks. So you expect when, something's being rolled out as quickly during a pandemic, you understand there's going to be some glitches, there's going to be some errors. But the government promised the banks that they would underwrite any losses 100%. So this kind of gave carte blanche to the banks just to dole out all this money in this bounce back loan thing. And basically what's happened is you've got fraudsters, gangsters, companies that didn't really exist getting all of this money, and the government just don't seem to care. They're just writing it off. And so Lord Agnew just furious about this, quite rightly, and he says this has to be challenged. So since he resigned, he did get lots of publicity as a result of that. And Rishi Sunak kind of tweeted, oh, yes, we'll look into it. But as Lord Agnew's gone on to say, how? What are you doing? And how can the banks get away with this? After the 2008 financial crash, it seems absolutely unbelievable that they can't be held to account for this fraud. And yes, given that the taxpayer is going to be paying so much more money out of their pockets, I think it's extraordinary waste of money.
Yeah, indeed. And Tom, just a word from you, though, on this story as well. I mean, Dominic Cummings is actually quoted in the article, in the comment piece, describing that madhouse that exists in Whitehall and the way in which the interconnectivity just isn't there between various government departments. I mean, what is your view on this story? Almost £4.5 billion lost. I mean, that's a huge amount of money.
It's a huge amount of money. And, you know, so much of this, I think you can put down to just the unprecedented situation that the government found themselves in. You know, they needed to move at speed. The fundamental thing was, how do we prop up businesses? How do we make sure that people can get through this? There's also been an awful lot of scrutiny, of course, about PPE contracts going to people who've never made PPE in their life. All of these kinds of things, which are genuinely unjust, really should be tackled. I guess the issue is when you're in an unprecedented situation, as we were, and the need to act with that level of efficiency and speed and all the rest of it, you do see cases like this. But I think a big problem, and Dominic Cummings has often pointed to this quite rightly, in my view, is the fact that just Whitehall doesn't work very well in normal times, let alone in times of crisis. So when it comes to trying to design schemes like this, when it comes to trying to bring in the private sector to a particular goal, again, the processes aren't necessarily there, even without the spectre of a global pandemic having to be brought out. So definitely something which I'm sure needs to be looked into if we ever find ourselves in anything resembling a crisis like this again.
Yeah, oh, dear goodness, hope not. Tom, though, your story, though, your first story is the double first and double standards, according to the Mail.
Yes, this is an investigation into a really fascinating case at Jesus College, Cambridge. So its chapel has various different amazing artefacts in it. There's a William Morris stained glass window, various kind of priceless sculptures, but there's also a small marble plaque depicting a guy called Tobias Rustat, who was a sort of 17th century courtier to Charles II, who donated to the college. But again, amidst all of the kind of discussions around decolonizing universities, around links to the slave trade and trying to reckon with that, this particular plaque has come under scrutiny because a small amount of his fortune was gained from the transatlantic slave trade. The thrust of this particular investigation, though, is asking questions about potential double standards, given the fact that Jesus College has quite close links to China. It's taken about £200,000 from the Chinese state, £155,000 from Huawei, which is, of course, the kind of state-aligned telecoms company from China. You've got professors who run non-profits, which are essentially paid for by sort of Chinese oligarchs, if you like. And this raises a difficult question, which is there's been a lot of kind of, again, sort of moral preening, I think it's you could say, about some of these kind of relics, if you like, of our ugly past and the history of colonialism and the slave trade. But at the same time, there seems to be a lack of interest in issues like this in the present. And if you're going to pose as being very morally pious about these issues, then questions are going to be raised about where you're getting your money from in the present. Because when you're going to people with deep pockets, often some of that money won't necessarily come from the most morally unimpeachable sources. And this story in particular, just contrasting that concern about one benefactor centuries ago who made a small proportion of his money from the slave trade, with, again, taking money from the CCP and what's going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghur Muslims at the moment. So, yeah, raising difficult questions for the college there.
Gemma, tell us about the stealth tax on graduates that the Mail has discovered.
I know. Well, interesting, off the back of the story I was talking about previously, where this 4.3 billion is just sort of being left. Ministers are being accused of making the cost of living crisis worse by freezing the student loan repayment threshold. So this is hitting graduates really with a tax rise by stealth. So they keep the salary threshold at 27,295, despite inflation rocketing to 5.4%, which is its highest in 30 years. So a graduate who earns £30,000 will end up paying 113 more towards their student loan over the next year. That's more than was previously indicated. So it's sort of like almost like going against the contract that they went into. But also, let's put this in context. I mean, I have a 17-year-old, so she went through her GCSEs during this time. That was bad enough, but I kept thinking, I am so glad that she's not at university stage. These are students who will have sat in a room their university years, horrendous, absolutely awful, not the university experience that you wish to pay for at all. Lectures on Zoom, just utterly rubbish. These are graduates who will be getting their first job, and let's face it, no hope of getting on the housing ladder as well compared to when I was young. So it really is quite hard for young people, and anybody who doesn't think so is sort of not very empathetic. So I think this is a bit tone deaf, especially given we're seeing, as I say, 4.3 billion just being written off by the Treasury. I just think this is going to stick in the throat a little bit.
I think it might. Tom, take us inside the Times to your almost namesake, Tom Tugendhat. Guess what? He fancies being Prime Minister. Who'd have thunk it?
Who'd have thunk it? And he's also one of the first really to come out and make it explicit, although I think it's been pretty clear that there are various other candidates. But he's given this interview to Times Radio, written up here, where Tom Tugendhat he's an MP, he's the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and he's essentially come out with his ambitions. He says he's not canvassing support, that there isn't a vacancy yet, but that of course it would be an honour to serve in that position, and so on and so forth. People may be familiar with his sort of pedigree. He was an army officer. He served in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Very hawkish on many foreign policy matters. If he was to become PM, I'd be slightly worried we'd be at war with about 3 different people by tea time, but nevertheless seen as a kind of move on from Johnson. He's trying to position himself as a character of integrity, and really kind of now you're starting to see the field sort of shape up with Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss obviously seen as the front runners, although they haven't necessarily come out and declared their intentions yet, and also Jeremy Hunt, the former health secretary, again potentially pondering another run. So yes, even though there's still not a lot of clarity as to when Johnson will go, you're already starting to see the potential successors circling, if you like.
You certainly can. Gemma, in 20 seconds, if you can, tell us about the man in his 80s who's been caught out by the cops.
Yeah, he's been driving without a licence since he was 12. They were absolutely stunned when they pulled him over. Thankfully, he hasn't hit anybody in that time or had any kind of accident. But yeah, there he is. He's been pootling around in his Mini, and it's finally caught up with him.